Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to Wednesday Night Reviews reading of Bloody Rose by Nicholas Eames. Mr. Eames has been kind enough to allow us to publish this reading to YouTube for everyone to enjoy. He is a Canadian-born writer, originally from Wingham, Ontario. After attending college for theater arts, he changed direction in life to become, in his own words, an epic fantasy writer. Based on the book you're about to enjoy, I'd say he's making great strides towards that goal. My name is Konrad, and I'll be your narrator tonight on this wild adventure. Now, where were we? Chapter 2, The Cornerstone. There were 4 people you could always find at the Cornerstone. The first was Tara, who owned the place. She'd been a mercenary herself before losing her arm. "I didn't bloody lose it," she'd say, whenever someone asked how it happened. "A bugbear tore it off and cooked it on a spit while I watched. I know exactly where it is. It's inside his damned dead body." She was a big, broad woman who used her remaining hand to rule her tavern with an iron fist. When she wasn't cussing out the kitchen or dressing down the serving staff, she spent her nights discouraging fights, often by threatening to start one, and swapping stories with some of the older mercs. Her husband Edwick was always there as well. He'd been the bard for a band called Vanguard, but was now retired. He took the stage each night to recount the exploits of his former crew and seemed to know every song and story ever told. Ed was the opposite of his wife. Slight of frame, cheerful as a child on a pony's back, he'd been close friends with Tam's mother, and despite Tam Hashford's rule concerning his daughter playing an instrument or consorting with musicians, the old bard often gave Tam lute lessons after work. Next was Tiamax, who'd been a member of Vanguard as well. He was an Arachnian, which meant he had 8 eyes, 2 of which were missing, covered by criss-crossing patches, and 6 hands with which to shake, stir, and serve drinks. Consequently, he made for an excellent bartender. According to Edwick, he'd been one hell of a fighter, too. The last permanent fixture in the Cornerstone was her Uncle Bran. In his youth, Brannigan had been an illustrious mercenary, a prodigious drinker, and a notorious scoundrel. But now, almost 10 years after his sister's untimely death had brought about the dissolution of his old band, he was still a thief, still a drunk, and an even more notorious scoundrel, though he'd since added compulsive gambling to his list of vices. He and Tam's father had spoken rarely over the past decade. One had lost a sister in Lily Hashford, the other a wife, and grief had led them each down very different paths. "Tam!" her uncle shouted at her from the second-floor balcony, directly above the bar. "Be a darlin' and fetch me a dram, will ya?" Tam set the stack of empty bowls she'd collected on the stained wood bar. The tavern was busier than usual tonight. Mercenaries, and those who come to rub shoulders with them, crowded the commons behind her. 3 herds were roaring, 2 fights were in progress, and a shirtless bard was beating a drum like it owed him money. "Uncle Bran wants a whiskey," she said to Tiamax. "Does he?" The Arachnian snatched up the bowls and began rinsing them with 4 hands, while the remaining 2 cracked open a wooden shaker and poured something fragrant and rose-colored into a long-stemmed glass. "What is this?" asked the woman he'd made it for. "Pink." "Pink?" She sniffed it. "It smells like cat pee." "Then order a fucking bear next time," said Tiamax. The mandibles sprouting from his white bristled chin twitched in irritation. One of them had snapped in half, so the sound they made was a blunted click instead of the melodious scratching others of his kind produced. The woman sniffed and sauntered off, while the Arachnian used a rag to dry 3 bowls at once. "And how will your Uncle Bran be paying for the whiskey, I wonder?" "Tell him to put it on my tab," came Bran's voice from the balcony above. She offered Tiamax a tight smile. "He says put it on his tab?" "Ah, yes, the inexhaustible tab of Brannigan Fay." Tiamax threw up all 6 of his arms in exasperation. "Alas, I'm afraid that line of credit is completely and utterly exhausted." "Says who?" demanded the disembodied voice of her uncle. Says who?" Tam replied. "Says Tara." "Tell that bastard Hatcher I'll handle Tara," yelled Bran. "Besides, I'm about to sweep the board up here." Tam sighed. "Uncle Bran says, bastard Hatcher." The bartender's mandibles clacked again, and Tam caught a malicious glint in the manifold facets of his eyes. "One whiskey," he exclaimed. "Coming right up." He chose a cup off the counter behind him and reached up with one segmented arm to retrieve a bottle from the very top shelf. It was coated in moldering grime and thick with cobwebs. When TMX pulled the stopper free, it fairly disintegrated in his hand. "What is that?" Tam asked. "Oh, it's whiskey. Or near enough, anyway. We found 6 casks of this in the cellar of Turnstone Keep while the Ferrells had us trapped inside." Like every ex-mercenary Tam knew, except, of course, her dad, TMX rarely missed an opportunity to recount a story from his adventuring days. "We tried drinking it," the Arachnian said, "but not even Maddie could keep it down. So we turned them into bombs instead." The stuff trickled from the bottle's mouth like honey, except it looked and smelled like raw sewage. "Here, tell your uncle it's on the house, courtesy of that bastard Hatcher." Tam eyed the cup skeptically. "You promise he won't die?" "He almost certainly won't die." The bartender placed a spindly hand over his chest. "I swear on my cephalothorax." "Your what?" Tara came bursting through the kitchen door wielding a sauce-stained wooden spoon as though it were a bloody cudgel. "You!" She leveled her makeshift weapon at a pair of burly mercs wrestling on the rushes in front of a fireplace. "Can't you read the bloody sign?" Lacking another arm with which to point, Tara used the spoon to draw their attention to an etched wooded board above the bar, and even deigned to read it to them. "No fighting before midnight. This is a civilized establishment, not a goddamn brawling pit." She started toward them, patrons scrambling from her path like she was a boulder rolling downhill. "Thanks, Max." Tam seized the cup and fell in behind the proprietress, using the swath she cleared to cross half the commons before plunging back into the mob. Tara, meanwhile, had kicked one fighter into a curling ball and was thrashing the other's ass with the wooden spoon. Tam slipped, slithered, and sidestepped her way toward the balcony stair, pilfering gossip like an urchin picking pockets in a market square. A trio of merchants were discussing the early frost that had wiped out most of Casker's harvest. They'd got rich importing provisions from Five Court. One of them made a jest about paying tribute to the Winter Queen, which drew a hearty laugh from the Northerner on his right, while the Namiri on his left gasped and traced the Summer Lord's circle over his breast. Many were discussing who would fight in the ravine tomorrow and, perhaps more importantly, what they'd be squaring off against. Fable, she heard, had opted to let the local wranglers decide, and rumor was they had something special in store. Most of the conversation swirled around the host of monsters assembling north of Cragmore, the Brummel Horde, they dubbed it, and everyone, from fighters to farmers, had an opinion as to what its intentions were. "Revenge," said a merc with a mouthful of something black and gummy. "Obviously, they're still sore about getting their asses kicked at Castilla 6 years ago. They'll try again next summer, mark my words." "They won't attack Castilla," insisted a woman with a white spider tattoo covering most of her face. "It's too far away, and too well defended. If you ask me, it's Ardburg needs to worry. The March Lords better keep their men sharp and their axes sharper." "This bronze-eyed fellow," mused Lufane, a skyship captain who made a living taking nobles on sightseeing tours above the Rhineshield Mountains. "Word is he's got a mighty grudge against us." "Us?" asked the spider face. "Everyone. Humans in general." The captain drained the last of his wine and handed his bowl off to Tam as she went by. "According to Brontide, we're the monsters. He led a raid over the mountains a few years back and managed to rubble every arena he could find." The first merc flashed a black-toothed sneer at that. "A giant called us monsters? Well, it don't matter much what he thinks, does it? The day after tomorrow, every band in the north will be bound for Cragmore, lusting for glory and looking to make a name for themselves. The Brummel Horde will be nothing but bones in the muck come spring," he was saying as Tam moved on. "But the bards will be crowing about it for the rest of their lives." He skirted the stage. The drummer had finished up, and now Edwick sat perched on a stool with his lute in his lap. He spared her a wink before starting into the Siege of Hollow Hill, which drew a chorus of cheers from the Commons crowd. They liked songs about battles, especially ones where the heroes were hopelessly outnumbered by their enemies. Tam loved the old man's voice. It was weathered and warbly, comfortable as a pair of soft leather boots. Besides teaching her to play the lute, Edwick had been giving Tam singing lessons as well, and his assessment of her vocal prowess had ranged from, "Careful, you'll break the glassware," to, "At least they won't drag you off stage," before finally she'd garnered an approving smile and the murmured words, "Not bad. Not bad at all." That had been a good night. Tam had returned home wishing she could share her joy with her dad, but Tuck Hashford would not have approved. He didn't want his daughter singing, or playing the lute, or listening to the lionized tales of retired bards. If not for the wage she brought home, and the fact that he'd had trouble holding down a job since his wife's death, Tam doubted she'd be allowed anywhere near the Cornerstone at all. Bran glanced over as she approached. "Tam!" He thumped the table with an open palm, scattering coins and toppling the carved wood figurines on the tetria board before him. His opponent, a hooded man with his back to Tam's side, and her uncle made a poor attempt at feigning innocence. "Oh dear, I accidentally upset the pieces. Let's call it a draw, Cloud, shall we?" "Is a draw where one person is about to win and the other cheats to avoid losing?" Bran shrugged. "Either one of us might have prevailed." "I was definitely going to prevail," said his opponent. "Brune, back me up here." Brune. Tam stopped where she stood, gaping like a baby bird beneath a dangling worm. Sure enough, the man sitting to her uncle's left was Brune, as in the Brune, as in Fable's fucking shaman, Brune. Legend or no, the Vargir looked like most other Northernmen. He was big and broad-shouldered, with shaggy brown hair that did its damnedest to hide the fact that Brune wasn't much to look at. His brows were wildly unkempt, his nose was crooked, and there was a finger-wide gap between his two front teeth. "I wasn't paying attention," the shaman admitted. "Sorry." Tam's mind was still reeling, struggling to make sense of what her eyes were telling her. If that's Brune, she reasoned, then the man in the cloak, the one Bran called Cloud. The figure turned, drawing back his hood to reveal long ears pressed flat against green gold hair. Tam's mind barely registered the ears, however, or the druid's pointed, predatory smile. She was pinned by his gaze, half moons hooked against a color like candlelight glancing through the facets of an emerald. "Hello, Tam." "He knows my name? How does he know my name?" "Had her uncle said it earlier?" "Probably, definitely." "Yes." Tam was shaking. Ripples shuddered across the surface of the Turnstone whiskey in her trembling hand. "Brannigan here was telling us all about you," said the Druid. "He says you can sing, and that you're something of a prodigy with the lute." "He drinks," Tam said. The shaman laughed, splurting a mouthful of beer over the table and the tetria board. "He drinks," Brune chuckled. "Classic." Freecloud produced a white moonstone coin and examined one side of it. "Brune and I are mercenaries. We're members of a band called Fable. You've heard of us, I assume?" She has." Bran came to her rescue. "Of course she has. Isn't that right, Tam?" "Right," Tam managed. She felt as though she'd wandered out onto a frozen lake, and suddenly the ice was groaning beneath her. "Well," said Freecloud, "it so happens we're in the market for a bard, and according to Brannigan, you're just what we're looking for. Assuming, of course, you're willing to get a little mud on your boots." "Mud on my boots?" Tam asked, watching cracks spiderweb across the ice in her mind's eye. "Uncle Bran, what have you done?" "He means travel," Bran told her. There was something thick in his voice, a sheen to his eyes that had nothing to do with being shit-faced drunk. At least she didn't think it did. "A real adventure, Tam." "Ah." Freecloud's chair scraped as he stood. The coin in his hand disappeared as he gestured behind her. "Here's the boss herself, Tam," he said, as she turned to find a legend in the flesh just an arm's reach away. "This is Rose." So that was it for Tam's knees. As they buckled beneath her, Bran leapt from his chair. He reached her in time to pluck the cup from her hands before she collapsed. "That was close," she heard him say as the floorboards rushed up to meet her. "She's too young," said someone, a woman's voice, harsh. "What is she, 16? 17. That was her uncle. I think. The age of 17, anyway. Not the sharp edge, grumbled the woman. Rose. It had to be. Tam blinked, got an eyeful of glaring torchlight, and decided to lie still a moment longer. And how old were you when you picked up a sword? Asked Freecloud. She could hear the wryness in the Druid's smile. Or when you killed that Cyclops? A sigh. Well, what about this? Armor clinking. She fainted at the sight of me. What will she do when blood gets spilled? She'll be fine, said her uncle. She's Tuck and Lily's girl, remember? Tuck Hashford? Brune sounded impressed. They say he was fearless, and we've all got a bit of our fathers in us. God knows I do. Our mothers, too, said a woman Tam didn't recognize. Does she even want to go? Have you asked? You do, said a voice in Tam's head. I do, she croaked. She sat up, instantly regretting it. The noise of the Cornerstone Commons screeched in her skull like a boat full of cats. The 4 members of Fable stood around her. Brain was kneeling beside her. I want to go, she insisted. Where are we going? Someplace cold, said the woman who wasn't Rose. It was the ink witch Kira, who regarded Tam as if she'd found the girl squished on the bottom of her boot. Where Rose was sturdy with lean muscle, Kira was waif thin and wiry. She wore a long, low-slung tunic cut high on the hip, and black leather boots boasting more straps than a madman's jacket. Her fine black hair was long enough to tie back, but shaved to stubble on either side. There were bone rings in her ears, another through her left eyebrow, and a stud in her nose. Her skin was porcelain pale and crowded with tattoos. Tam's eye was drawn to a sea creature inked on Kira's thigh, its serpentine tentacles curling out from beneath the hem of her tunic. The ink witch caught her staring and gave the cloth an inviting tug. Have you ever seen one up close? Her impish tone implied that she wasn't referring to the creature tattooed on her leg. Tam looked away, hoping her sudden flush was attributed to the fall. You're going to fight the Brummel Horde? She asked. We're not, said Rose. We're finishing our tour first, and after that, we have a contract in Darmarch. A final contract, said Freecloud. He shared a meaningful look with his bandmates. One last gig before we call it quits. Brannigan perked up at that, but before either he or Tam could ask anything further, Rose cut in. I should warn you, she said. What we're going up against could be just as dangerous as the Horde, worse even. To Tam, there was nothing worse than the prospect of never leaving home, of being cooped up in Ardburg until her dreams froze and her wild heart withered in its cage. She glanced at her uncle, who gave her a reassuring nod, and was about to tell Freecloud that it didn't matter if they were facing the Horde, or something worse than the Horde, or if they were bound for the Frost Mother's hell itself. She would follow. One song, said Rose. Brannigan looked up. Say what? Take the stage. Rose set a half-pipe between her lips and rooted between her armor for something to light it with. Eventually she gave up and settled for a candle off the table beside her. Pick a song and play it. Convince me you're the right girl for the job. If I like what I hear, then congratulations, you're Fable's new bard. If I don't... What was your name again? Tam. Well, in that case, it's been nice knowing you, Tam.